Hello houseplant friends and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today I am going to be delivering to you the entire history of houseplant collecting. I've been researching this for days and I feel pretty confident with what I am about to present you with. I have done a ton of research, and if you would like to look at any of my sources or see where I got any of my information, you will have free access to my Google Doc, which I will have linked in the description. The history of houseplant collecting is not as clean as you might like to imagine. It is full of colonialism, supremacy, classism, driving certain species to extinction, which has still not been recovered from, and many, many more things. There are a lot of amazing things that did come out of the houseplant collecting and out of plant domestication and botany, but today we are going to be focusing on houseplant collecting, where it originated from, who originally started doing it as far back as we can track, and how did that get us here today. To get to the very beginning of houseplant collecting, we need to go back 10,000 years to the Neolithic period of the world. We are going to be talking about plant domestication. The definition of domestication is the process of adapting plants and wild animals for the purposes of human use. The first recorded cases of plant domestication go all the way back to Mesopotamia, where they domesticated wheat, barley, lentils, and peas. Over in Asia at the same time, they were working on domesticating rice. Now we're going to do a quick jump over to the topic of botany. Botany is a branch of biology that deals with the study of plants, including their structures, properties, and biochemical processes. Also included are plant classification and the study of plant diseases and interactions with the environment. The first traces of botany developed by human people were in isolated tribes across South America, Africa, and New Guinea. These tribes had an extensive knowledge of what plants were, whether or not they were edible, medicinal, or poisonous. These tribes' original use of nomenclature mirrors our nomenclature today, but in its own different way. So now that we know where all of this originated from, we're going to make another big jump to 668 BCE in Nineveh. This whole thing was actually pretty cool because I grew up reading the Bible like a lot of people. Nineveh and a lot of the people that we're going to be talking about for the next few minutes were also in the Bible. So it's interesting reading about these people in a non-biblical standpoint. So the very first recorded plant garden, which was for all intents and purposes a symbol of wealth, of money, of class, purely existed for the purposes of looking beautiful. And it wasn't more so about the types of plants they collected, more so about literally collecting all of the rare plants from other areas and bringing them into this garden, which was known as the North Palace of Ashurbanipal. If I'm not saying that correctly, please forgive me. Located in Nineveh around 668 BCE, this was the very first massive garden collection that we have in recorded history. The Assyrian kings had this beautiful garden written down and carved out of stone and rock, and they boasted about their great feats of the plants that they collected and the animals that they collected that they kept there. They would collect these plants and animals from various surrounding areas, other countries. They had sprawling orchards which included plants such as pomegranates, pears, figs, olives, and other exotic plants that were not able to be described at the time. The gardens are described as being sprawling, vast, and mountainous, having parks for sports, parks of just grassy fields and trees, and then separate sections where they would keep the animals and the rare plants. This is really, really important because this is the first documented proof that we have that a place like this existed. And the proof actually looks like this. It's this beautiful engraving. There's a couple of them that are actually being kept in Britain at a museum. It is rumored that these gardens were built by the second king of Assyria, Sennacherib. However, these gardens were vastly overshadowed by the rumors that surrounded the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which is a place that no one actually knows if it existed or not, which is just wild to me. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon were rumored to have been built by King Nebuchadnezzar II. Yes, the very one that you read about in the book of Isaiah, I think. And he is fabled to have built them for his queen at the time, Amytis, who was from Persia, and she missed her rolling gardens in the plants in Persia. So he built her this massive hanging garden for her to enjoy and feel like she was at home, even though she was in a different country. In this garden are fabled to have been palms and dates, cedars, and extremely bright flowers, and other exotic plants and animals. There is no proof that the Hanging Gardens of Babylon ever existed. Stories that old storytellers would tell of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon at the time, it actually very closely resembles what the North Palace of Ashurbanipal actually looked like. And so historians believe that people confused the North Palace of Ashurbanipal's gardens with this Garden of Babylon, because even though Nebuchadnezzar did have a wife named Amytis, there is no recorded history by Babylon, and there are no signs in any of the ruins, no plant life, no animal bones have been dug up that would indicate that these gardens ever existed in Babylon. These plants were collected solely for the purpose of showing off how many plants that they had. And in the case of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, they were collected in order to make his wife happy. It's not a new thing. People collecting these rare specimens of plants to show off their beauty to other people, using them as a status symbol, is also incredibly not new. And it's something that we're going to dive deeper a lot deeper into actually later on in this video. So we started this story 10,000 years in the past in the Neolithic era. Then we jumped forward to 668 BCE, and now we're jumping forward to 500 to 400 BCE to discuss botany and how it was first created. In 500 to 400 BCE is when houseplants first arrived to the Greeks and the Roman powers. A century later, in 300 BCE, is when we get our first big name in the houseplant world. Because you see, in 300 BCE, we had Theophrastus, who studied under Plato and became a disciple of Aristotle. Theophrastus is who is credited with the creation of botany. So you could say he's kind of a big deal. He created over 200 botanical treatises that are still credible to this day. They were translated into Latin, and they are now known under the names of De Causis Plantarum and De Historica Plantarum. Pardon the pronunciation. After Theophrastus, we have a massive blip in time, and we end up jumping all the way to 40 BCE. That is because botany had only just become a thing, and it didn't even really have a technical name yet. There wasn't really a whole job market for botanists to do things. It was pretty much just Theophrastus and then the people who ended up being disciples underneath Theophrastus. However, we don't start seeing significant details happening in this houseplant timeline until 42 BCE, when the Romans developed greenhouses. I did a bad job of explaining this in the video, so I'm going to re-explain it here. Basically, the Romans version of the greenhouse was a proto-greenhouse, which was referred to as the specularium or the specularia. It basically consisted of, quote, beds mounted on wheels which they moved out into the sun and then on wintry days withdrew under the cover of frames glazed with transparent stone, so like glass, but this was called lapis specularis or mica. And the reason they were doing this is because Emperor Tiberius really liked cucumber and he needed it every single day for his health, so they had to develop a way to grow cucumbers year-round, and thus was the birth of the proto-greenhouse. We got greenhouses, y'all! Then, in the 1st century CE, okay, number 1, the 1st century, we get Pedonius Dioscorides. Pedonius Dioscorides? This guy described approximately 600 different plants. And for 15 centuries, this guy's word was considered the final word on all things botany. You guys, I'm not kidding you. From the 1st century to the 1500s, It was just this guy. Literally just this guy. Everyone was like, oh yeah? You think you know better than this guy? Well, you don't, because he knows everything and you don't know anything for 15 centuries. Then in 1552, the first technically herbarium was created. If you don't know what an herbarium is, it's basically when botanists take plant samples and then they like put them in their book.
So actually the first herbarium was in 1532 and it was owned by Gherardo Cibo, a student of Luca Gini in Italy.
First kind of look at a herbarium from Mexico. It detailed tons of plants from all over Mexico and it was written in Aztec. That is so cool. So in 1552, that Aztec first herbarium of Mexico plants was translated into Latin. All right, you guys, now we really get to get rolling on this timeline here. It's the 1600s, okay? Botanists decided, hey, what if we just stopped really describing only medicinal plants and only useful plants? And what if we just started describing all plants? And all the other botanists were like, good idea. So in the 1600s, the botanists got wild and they started going ham. They were describing plants left and right from all over the world, even from America, Africa, and Asia. We're gonna get into Asian plants in a little bit, but that is like a whole topic. We get our next big boom in botany when Robert Hooke describes a cell for the first time. He coined the term when he was observing plant material. Then you guys, it's 1693. My boy, Charles Plumier describes Monstera. And the beginning of all of our lives started. A ton of other important things happened in the 1600s in terms of botany and biology, but we are not going to talk about those things in this video. It's the 18th century, the 1700s. What is going on in the world of plants? Well, for starters, greenhouses arrived in America for the very first time. A merchant named Andrew built the first greenhouse in America in 1737. It unfortunately did not survive the times. Then, way later in 1798, Theodore Lyman, who we're going to talk about a little bit later as well, built America's oldest surviving greenhouse. You can still go visit this greenhouse to this day. It's the 1700s, houseplants are still widely unavailable and they are still really seen as a status symbol for royalty and noblemen and also, of course, botanists. So being into plants like wasn't a big thing. We are starting to see the first recesses of it spread out into the public, but it's only for really rich people at this point in time. It's still really only for really rich people, but now it's for really rich people and also botanists. Obviously merchants who are bringing over some stuff, but we're not really seeing houseplants develop yet. All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's the 1800s. It's the 19th century. What is happening? Well, first of all, it's the Victorian era now. So much is happening. We have the Industrial Revolution, literally so much. So let's break this all up into bite-sized pieces. Number one, because of the Industrial Revolution, houses were better. Some houses had heating and incredible light, which made that a great environment for houseplants. And also, houseplants are now, by the way, available suddenly, a century later, for almost people of all classes. Not all plants, by the way, but there are some plants that are available for the poor people. There was this kind of notion that these exotic plants were really only reserved for the extremely wealthy and the collector, for the extremely wealthy, for the nobleman, for the botanist who could make the trek to go do the collections. And as we'll get into at the later half of the 1800s, that was a scary job. So you're asking me, Ashley, what were the popular plants? You're telling me that plants are now widely available for people of almost all classes. What plants were those? We have an assortment of plants, many of which are still popular today. We have geraniums, fuchsias, begonias, ivies, lantana, ferns, rubber plants, petunias. Specifically, ferns and ivies were pretty much reserved as indoor plants. They were the most popular indoor plant at the time. Also, palms were super popular, citrus trees, mega popular cast iron plants. Once greenhouses became more widely available for people to just add onto their house, people actually started calling them orangariums or orangariums because it's where they put all their citrus trees. Citrus trees were like the thing. If you didn't have a citrus tree, did you even collect plants in the 1800s? I don't think so. I forgot to snap at the end there. All right, let's talk about our boy Lyman again, okay? So he built the oldest surviving greenhouse, right, in 1798. So he added on to it in the 1800s. In 1804, he built the first grape house. He also added on, and in the 1820s, a camellia greenhouse. And in the 1840s, he added on a sales greenhouse. My boy was ahead of the times, okay? All right, now let's jump over to Europe again real fast. Kew Gardens, the whole Kew Center, the ones that know everything about plants ever, yeah, they were constructed between 1844 and 1848 in England. Also, at this exact same time, Scindapsus, Rhaphidophora, Epipremnum, and many other genuses were being described for the very first time. The 1800s, the Victorian era, was a boom, not only for botany, but also for houseplants in general, especially many of the houseplants that are super duper popular today. Now, we're gonna get a little bit freaky. We're gonna talk briefly, and I will be making an entire history of this, which is Orchid Delirium. You heard that right. So in the late 1800s, okay, Orchid Delirium is described as, let me get the actual, Orchid Delirium was known as an incurable psychological illness marked by a need to pillage and possess. Sounds like he's getting real old school with it, real 668 BCE with it, if you know what I mean. Okay, so Orchid Delirium was basically this craze that took over people in England and Britain in the 1800s. It was marked by nobility and orchid hunters, you guys. They were not botanists doing research trips. They were orchid hunters, and their job was to poach orchids from all over the world, bring them back, and sell them for massive amounts of money. Does that sound familiar? So not only would these people go and poach, the orchids from, and I'm calling it poaching because that's what it was. It wasn't collecting, they were poaching. They were stealing, they were exporting these plants, orchids specifically, from all over the world. And actually, Orchid Delirium, and this is where we're gonna get kind of a little dark with this video, very rooted in colonizer behavior. So basically what would happen is England would go colonize, and then these orchid hunters would just traipse along after the colonizers, and once it was kind of like safe enough, the orchid hunters would just go. And then they would go and they'd try to get as many orchids as they possibly could. There's a quote in this article, and it said that some orchid hunters would come back with between 7,000 to 47,000 orchids. So here's a quote actually from this article that said the orchid stood for supremacy. Supremacy of knowledge, culture, and whiteness. So yes, at the time, orchids were a huge symbol of not only white by these colonizers going out and taking over these countries, and instead of letting those people be, just completely taking over and then bringing back everything to their own country for themselves. Does this not sound like something similar that we read about at the very beginning of this video, 668 BCE? The North Palace of Ashurbanipal, where he went around and killed a bunch of people and then stole all their plants and built his own garden? Yes, that's exactly what's happening. They're bringing plants, they're bringing orchids from South America, they're bringing orchids back from Africa, they're bringing orchids from Asia, they're bringing orchids from everywhere. And this led to a mass orchid extinction event, specifically with lady slipper orchids, or Paphiopedilums. If you watched my video on why stealing houseplants is bad, you would know that we discussed Paphiopedilums and sites. There are international protections that are in place for many plants that are partially extinct or on the border of extinction, and lady slipper orchids, or Paphiopedilums, are one of those plants. They nearly went extinct. There are, by the way, Paphiopedilums that were native to not only North America, but also Europe. But almost all of those orchids have completely gone extinct because during the 1800s, people just sold and sold and sold and took and took and took, and they left no remnants behind. So yes, unfortunately, houseplant collecting has not always been so clean. It's never really been clean, but I don't think people really know, and I especially didn't know, kind of the dark history, especially with orchids. So to make a long story short, Orchid Delirium started coming to an end. These orchid hunters started mysteriously disappearing and or being murdered. And I am not lying about that. Orchid hunters would go try to collect these plants, and then they would either mysteriously die, they would be killed off by other orchid hunters who wanted to steal their bounty, or they would be killed off by locals who wanted to protect their wildlife. They were dying left and right. In one expedition, 7 orchid hunters left together, literally only one returned. And he did return, I believe, with all of the orchids that were collected. In the 1850s, we saw a similar epidemic spread with fern fever. And this was more of an epidemic of the lower classes, kind of like the middle and upper class. They were super duper obsessed with all these different types of ferns, the Boston fern, the maidenhair fern, the rabbit fern, all of these different ferns. They became super duper mega popular. Then boom, we are in the 1900s, the 20th century, and the first big thing that we see is that at the end of World War I, houseplants were pretty much out and cacti and succulents were in. Plants were still only really owned by kind of like the middle to upper class, so people that could really afford them, but it was starting to spread out between even the lower classes. In 1926, we see Monrovia Gardens, which I'm sure all of you have heard of before, get established, and they were the first commercial plant nursery to sell potted plants. So potted plants are very, very recently established. Then in the 1930s, we start to see garden societies develop, and when you are thinking of garden societies, really you should not be thinking of, you know, the philodendron or the begonia society. Those are very new developments, but we are talking about amaryllis societies and the shrub and bulb societies, like outdoor gardening. Then in the 1950s, Scandinavian design became super popular in America, and there was a massive house plant revival, which didn't really super duper kick off until the 60s and 70s. In the 70s, plants were so popular that the New York Times for the first time published a piece about local houseplant shops which you can go buy houseplants in. Then in the 1990s, we see Bill Wurtz, who worked at NASA, release his report on how houseplants freshen up your air and purify your air. And his report was very, very exaggerated. Houseplants really don't purify your air. You would need to have it's something like 1 plant per square foot or 1 large plant per 3 square feet. So you would need to have plants over your entire house for them to really be able to purify their air. So your plants, you won't have 1 pothos. Most people be like, oh, I'm gonna buy a plant to help me with my air, and they buy a pothos, and that's really not how it works. People ate it up, and so people started buying plants left and right for their office space, for their restaurants, because it was the super new trend of the 90s. So now that we're in the late 90s, let's discuss some late 90s popular houseplants. Most of these are still popular today, and they are more so what we refer to when we talk about common plants, at least on my channel. That would be the fern, Dieffenbachia, Monstera, Anthurium, palms, bird of paradise, ficus. Ficus were super duper popular in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Corn plants, also very popular since the 70s. Spider plants and zebra plants, also very popular in the 70s. Then we're gonna jump into the 2000s. In the plant community, Asian culture has often been appropriated. In the 2000s, feng shui became very, very popular with America. More of the middle and upper class Americans adopting this idea of feng shui, and so lucky bamboo became extremely popular in the early 2000s. So much so that all growing up, I know that I had a lucky bamboo in my bedroom. I actually had one. It was my very first houseplant that I ever had, and it was with me for over 9 years. And I didn't even think of it as a houseplant. It was just my bamboo, and I loved it for some reason. And I actually never thought about that. I guess that was my very first houseplant ever. Huh. So Lucky Bamboo was super duper popular. You'll still see it sold in almost every single grocery store that you go to. And now that we're here in the 2020s, what are we really seeing? So let's create a timeline of events for all of this, okay? So we have our 10,000 BCE, which was the Neolithic era of the first domestication of plants, which occurred simultaneously all over the world. Then we have 668 BCE, which is the Nineveh North Palace of Ashurbanipal and the Hanging Gardens of Babylon around the same exact time. Then we have massive jump in time to 500 and 400 BCE, which is houseplants arriving to the Mediterranean powers of the Greek and the Romans in the 400 to 500 BCE. Then we have 300 BCE was Theophrastus and his creation of botany. Then we have 42 BCE was the Roman greenhouses, and then the 1st century CE was Pedonius, and he described over 600 plants. And for 15 centuries, he was the go-to guy on plants. Then super mega jump 15 centuries ahead in time, we are at 1552, and the first herbarium, quote unquote herbarium of plants from Mexico that was written in Aztec was translated into Latin. Then we get to the 1600s, which is when botanists stopped focusing on plants mostly for medicinal purposes and started off a whole sect of just exotic and tropical plants and describing every single plant that they could find. This also included the time when the term cell was first coined. The Monstera genus was described according to some sources. Botany got super duper revamped and biology became a big thing. Then in the 1700s, we see Monstera and pothos first described according to Kew University. That was in 1763 and 1753. Earlier 1700s, we see greenhouses first arrive in the 1700s, and the first one was built that did not survive in 1737. And then in 1798, the oldest surviving greenhouse was built by Theodore Lyman, and that greenhouse is still visible to this day in America. Plants are not widely available at this time. Then we jump ahead to the 1800s, and plants are on their way to even the lower classes of people in Europe. Some plants during this time are still very popular to this day, including ferns, rubber plants, ivy, and begonias. Orangeriums became very popular, and many people started having their own orangeriums built in their homes or around their homes. Lyman added on to his 1798 greenhouse in 1804, in 1820, and then again in 1840s. In 1832, 1842, and 1857, Scindapsus rhipidophora and Epipremnum, respectively, were described. And then suddenly the orchid craze hit the late 1800s, which is known as Orchid Delirium. This is when a massive amount of orchids went extinct all over the world and were brought back to England. 1900s, that is when at the end of World War I, cacti and succulents got very popular for the first time. Then in 1926, Monrovia becomes the first commercial plant seller of potted plants. In the 1930s, garden societies started to become developed. In the 1970s, and in 1973, New York Times published an article about houseplant shops for the first time. In 1990 is when NASA's Bill Wurtz released his first findings about how houseplants purify the air. In the 2000s, Lucky Bamboo became mega popular. Now we are in 2020s, 2021 to be exact, and I would say that looking back in time now across what happened with plants is it seems as though plants have always been a symbol of status and class among people. It's super interesting to see how plants have pretty much always been collected to be a commodity. They've never, like plants that are collected obviously for hobby aren't for use of anything other than a hobby, so of course they're gonna be a commodity. And of course back in the day, it just makes sense that mostly wealthy people are able to afford them. It seems that in modern day, 2021, it almost feels like with these prices that are developing, that plants are no longer for everyone. It seems like they are again becoming a symbol of class and of wealth, and of only if you have this thing, you're this, and you need to have this to do this. And just as an analysis of, you know, what we've seen in the past and what we're seeing in the present, it does seem very indicative that houseplants are again becoming symbol of status. And if you only collect common plants, you're not as cool as me who only collects rare plants. And I personally, I collect both. I love common plants and I love rare plants equally. Actually, I would say I'm actually way more into common plants lately than I am into rare plants, just because I don't like those price tags. I've stopped looking at the rare label on plants, especially in the last year, and instead I just focus on, you know, what do I like just for me. So I would love to know your thoughts in the comment section down below of where you think we're at in 2021. I would say that the most popular plants right now by far are the Epipremnum aureum, super duper popular plant. I think Monstera deliciosa, super duper popular. Monstera deliciosa albo, sport variegated, Thai constellation, any variety of variegated Monstera. I think Philodendron pink and white princess, mega popular, super expensive. Some of these plants, by the way, have always been expensive. And of course, I've only been in the plant community for a couple years. I'm only 22 years old and I do not have the history of going through the birth of the houseplant craze in America from the 60s and onward. So I would love to hear any and all thoughts you guys have in the comment section. If you have any corrections for me to make, please send your source and then quote for the correction, and I will check that out and I will make any corrections to this timeline in my description down below. And I would love to know your thoughts about anything in this video. I'm super excited to share this video. I've been doing so much research. Anyways, just go check out my bibliography, and yeah, I hope that you guys liked this video, this history of houseplant collection. I'm gonna be doing a ton more videos like this, so if you did like this video, please make sure you subscribe. Sharing this video would also be super duper great. It helps my channel a lot, and also make sure you hit that like button if you did like it. Disliked it, you are also welcome to hit the dislike button, but fair warning, it does the same thing for engagement as the like button. I tried to do my research as best as I can. I spent days researching this video. Pretty proud of what I have to present to you. So I also want to apologize for any mispronunciations of names. I'm not the best at name pronunciations. But with all of that being said, thank you so much for watching this video. Please make sure you hit like, subscribe, and tweet me at PlantMeAshley. Follow me on Instagram at PlantMeAshley. For real, I do tons of really cool content there. I also have YouTube memberships, which you are welcome to check out at the link in the description. And I also have some really cute merch linked in the description as well. I have all of my notes and sources listed, including for photos, listed in my sources in the description, which you are welcome to go check out at any time. But other than that, I will see you guys in the next houseplant history or houseplant section. Let me know what you guys think of this series so far, and leave me any recommendations for more houseplant histories you'd like to see in the future in the comment section down below. And I'll see you guys in the next houseplant section. Goodbye.
Thank you so much for all the extra channel support to Botanicas, Crazy Chick Vintage, The Planted Cauliflower, Tara Wolfgang, and All the Green Places.